So I'm going to start. Basically, I'm going to share kind of a prelude and then my bio, and then Ellen will start sharing the slides that I will make commentary on. So it's interesting. When I wrote the first part of this, I had no idea what Thursday was going to be like as far as the weather, but we do have a lovely Thursday. People could be anywhere. And thank you for joining us for Ellen and myself, invited by Professor Pallavi Sharma to share our contrasting and comparable experiences resulting in advocacy art. And thank you for allowing the time, because as I said, you could be at the beach. I would be at the beach. But different than Monday's workshop, we are beginning at the start of our art life journey and move forward until we reach where we stopped on Monday to the 1980s. So I'm going to start, as I said, with a prelude, and I think my prelude is actually longer than my bio. I was trying to make sure I fit in my 15 minutes. So this is basically a little background about my parents and family life, because when you hear Ellen's, you'll see how different our lives started out, very, very differently. So we're in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Mom told me when I was 6 years old, a teacher gave her a watercolor set. You know, the type where it's a tin with various colors, because I was so focused during the session allocated to art. But this is obviously elementary school. So my parents used ingenious games to teach me and seven siblings basic math, reading, and writing. Mom and Dad loved to read. There were bookshelves my dad built and installed high and low under the living room windows, on the walls, over furniture, and high up, separating the living room from the dining room, so an occasional visiting adult relative could walk under them. Encyclopedias, which probably none of you know what that is, they are. We had three different manufacturers' sets of encyclopedias. And I enjoyed learning about whatever topic was given as homework. My father had mechanical drawing abilities, yet due to prejudice, worked as a mail handler for the post office. And Mom, who loved singing and drawing ink portraits, managed everything that had to do with taking care of family, including Dad. Now, I should say, even though I would say because there are so many families now that have moms and dads of different cultures, my mom and dad were both African American, just to make that clear. That was typical in the 1950s. With such a large family, I remember foods such as government cheese, butter, powdered milk, and times my mom included us children to glue S&H green stamps into a miniature book that was redeemed for products. I don't remember what Mom got. I do know at some point my parents made a decision that Mom also needed to work. Their combined income upgraded what Mom achieved, since she remained the facilitator of the house and everyone, while she continued to work as a mail handler for the post office. At some point, the family had our first TV. It was a floor model where we gathered together. Beyond Mom and Dad's teachings and what we were learning in school, we also became aware of a world that wasn't African Americans, because there was Dobie Gillis, I Love Lucy, The Honeymooners, Bonanza, Ozzie and Harriet, Rawhide, Gunsmoke, Dragnet, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The family also enjoyed LPs, which for those who are younger, the long playing records, albums, on a phonograph inside the stereo. My parents exposed me to such diverse music as Ahmad Jamal, which is one of his favorite pieces was Poinsettia, Nina Simone's Little Girl Blue, Ravi Shankar's sitar music, the Modern Jazz Quartet, Herb Albert and the Tijuana Brass, Chico Hamilton, Leonard Bernstein, Peter Nero, George Gershwin, Boston Pops, Philadelphia Orchestra, Earl Gardner, Oscar Peterson, Ella Fitzgerald, Mom's favorite, and Madame Butterfly, Nat King Cole, Sarah Vaughan, Carmen McRae, and a zillion others. So my parents were very strict and didn't allow socializing beyond school. So no wonder I was a precocious yet introverted child. I received various awards for my art throughout primary and secondary school, which pleased my parents. I stayed on my artistic journey, attending a technical high school offering commercial art. I graduated, yet dejected because the art teacher who did not like African-American students gave me a failing grade. That offset by 4 years my desire to attend a prestigious women's art college in Philadelphia. I was accepted on the strength of my portfolio after those 4 years of working and achieved being on the dean's list the first year. So I was asked by the dean to explain the failing grade in art from high school. And I said, allowing a student to explain their grades gives a fuller context of what college staff reviews, because it's not fair to presume that somebody has a failing grade and you know that they didn't do what they were supposed to do, which was not the case with me. So this is my short bio. With perseverance, I obtained my BFA from college of my choice, Moore College of Art and Design. I then determined to live away from the city of brotherly love, as Philadelphia is known, and I included in my packing mom's reminders to toughen up, be observant, make a life spending no more than what I make, and to not keep up with the Joneses. Today it would be the Kardashians or Roy, I'm going to mispronounce this. Somebody said about pronunciations. I think it's Roy Ariso. Roy K. Yes, Arisu. And that's, I'm trying to broaden like who would be similar in those contexts of keeping up with the Joneses. So it was a year after college in mid-1970s when I moved to the San Francisco Bay Area. After 40 years along my art journey, professional development included adding graphic skills, fine art skills, and business skills. I obtained an MFA Arts Administration certificate, to exert strength from the choice of 3 names I was given by my parents and one attached after I married. I introduced myself as Tomyé. My tagline, living artist, adds to the no nonsense of wanting appreciation and investment while I can benefit from it. I don't want people to collect my art after I'm dead because that doesn't do me any good. That's what that whole thing means. This in turn allows me to support artists by collecting their art. I'm fortunate some of my gouache paintings, ink drawings, mixed media, and fused glass sculptures are in private collections and Alameda County Art Collection. I interchange my artist TAM with different hats for mentoring, teaching, advocating for funds, reviewing art projects, writing grants, as a gallery director, collaborating on projects, curating and installing art, and occasionally delving into my own student life by going back to classes. You can look for my name, sometimes 3 of the 4 Tomyé Neal-Madison, as a participating artist in gallery exhibitions, art centers, retailers, and now, of course, online. So with that, I am going to start my share, hopefully have it in order with Ellen's help. And let me do this. Okay, so the first image that comes up, and again, we're starting from the beginning. So in the 1970s, well, actually specifically in 1974, I moved here, and this one is called Street Artist Chums. I started my experience with my art because I was already what I would like to think as an accomplished artist. But as far as professionalism, that's usually something someone else determines that you're professional, but usually it starts with when you're selling something, have sold something, or have had something published in a book or a magazine, or like some of the illustrators that are in the group who mentioned that they want to do books, that kind of thing. So I, during the 1970s, experienced something new, a caring circle of street artists. And several of you mentioned that. That's important. You want to have a circle of people who really care for you. There would be many times when I realized an artist's life is a gift. Art minimizes many differences, drawing us together. And someone mentioned that, that's really important. I did eventually lose touch with each of the artists in this watercolor. If I were a user of social media, which I am not, I probably would have had some reconnections. So there are two on this slide. The one to the left is sister doing sister's hair, and the one on the right is sister reading to brother. So I fabricated very few textile artworks, but the one on the left, I forgot why I was determined to do this particular painting, especially on a handkerchief. But I was moved to do it on a handkerchief, and for the young viewers, it may seem a nasty habit to carry around a hanky, which was what they were jokingly called smear with snot. But the beautiful plaid border seemed a perfect mat to surround an artwork. I don't remember where the image came from. Mom had taught all my siblings, which included 4 boys, how to sew and mend. So the main image is a painting with watercolor at the time. I wasn't using gouache then. This is watercolor. And thread, which is thread around the hair, thread around their necks and on their arms and around their legs to simulate bracelets and anklets and things like that. And that's the main image is a painting. I said that. On the right is a sentiment where a sister is reading to her brother, and that's primarily an ink drawing with just their faces rendered in watercolor. So this is a close-up of what's called Close Fish in the Science Museum. So again, a painting that's lighthearted experience was my impetus. A bit of my experimental side began to manifest during the 80s. Single-use disposable cameras became popular. And I don't know if they're still around, they may be, but these are throwaway cameras that had film in them, but anyway, you could just use them one time and toss them away. So I used the camera to photograph friends' boys that I was chaperoning while we visited the aquarium. There was a sticker admonishing photographing water, and I had to see what would happen because that's just my nature. So voila, I replicated the size of the photograph tenfold as this gouache painting and gave it to the boys' parents. So while viewing art within Moore College of Art, where I attended, the calligraphy captured my attention. I also do calligraphy, and somebody had mentioned, I think it was Ellen, who said, sometimes I like to handwrite letters, but a lot of times I use the computer because my handwriting has gotten less clear. But I think it's really important for people to send notes to people instead of just texting and phoning and all the other things that we do to avoid writing. So anyway, this particular one, we are not speaking. When I viewed it, I read it and reread it, and the finite statement disturbed me. We are not speaking the same future. We are not speaking of the same future, never. And this is kind of interesting because we're talking about advocacy and having people come to the same place so that we can change things that aren't good. So if you are to believe this and say we're not speaking of the same future, never, it is not, it's far from optimistic, which is what a lot of you mentioned. And I think it's important for us to see things like this, but have come to our own conclusion of whether or not this should be taken in. And I just decided that I wasn't going to have this affect me because I don't want to believe this. It's kind of a downer. And on the same par, this is an Asian notice in a window somewhere along a main street in Oakland that I was walking. And again, the calligraphy, I always believed that the calligraphy, Japanese Asian calligraphy is so beautiful. it's like a dance. It's these characters that are formed and they're just beautifully created, but I can't read it. So I went ahead and read the English portion, and it speaks of not eating meat. I don't know if people can read that. For hundreds of thousands of years, the stew in the pot has boiled up a resentment very hard to dispel. If you want to know why there are calamities and wars in the world, just listen to the sounds from a slaughterhouse at midnight. If that's not I was going to say boom type of thought. So the interesting thing when I read that was, okay, I was an eat meater, and the first time I gave up eating meat was because I was a street artist and I couldn't afford to buy meat. And then it changed where I became a non-meater through health concerns. And I occasionally shift my thoughts of not eating anything that lives in water because I still eat oysters and shrimp and things like that. But then I think about plants, and plants have a life cycle. And so I'm thinking, I eat a lot of vegetables, and I'm thinking, well, that's something that used to live. So the dilemma, I think, of shifting human beings' attitudes towards one another is more important than this particular one. We shall overcome. I became aware of more hostility towards working people of different ethnicities. There was nothing uncertain about my decision to begin making art referencing the existence of discrimination. For those familiar with my art, I often created ink drawings that were of subjects depicting activities universally uplifting among those of us who work 9 to 5, which at this time I had a job that was a 9 to 5. Many times my 8.5 by 11 drawings, which is letter size, were enlarged as gouache paintings. This one was not. This was a commission. And my direction was significantly different with this one. So I was encouraged to learn more about the topic. And even though I'm African American, African Americans did not learn a whole lot about our culture, especially in my time period, like other cultures, because it was squashed, it was minimized. And if it was mentioned at all, it was usually something derogatory. So this experience led me to create more provocative images. Sorry, I'll do another page. So this one, it comes up for me. Okay, so moving along this new journey of creating advocacy art stimulates my altruistic nature. And by that, I mean, I may have mentioned that I was director of a grassroots gallery, and I loved it so much, I accepted there wasn't going to be a salary for me, which is kind of cuckoo to do. But anyway, I lived off my savings. And again, my mixed media, fused glass, and printed text required me to research the topic. This is the outline. If this were perhaps a little bit darker, you might see this is an outline of Lincoln. His top hat is up here. It's a little bit of his face. There's his ear on this side, and then goes down to his shoulders. And this glass piece rests on atop one of his speeches, which is actually giving African Americans freedom, but it took a couple of years for the whole of the United States to know that. So that's a point of interest for that particular piece of artwork. And then the very last one, this is a fan of Martin Luther King Jr. So this is a large gouache painting. The scale of this was created to be very impactful. The height is almost 6 feet high. I wanted the intent of the look of the youngster to be at the adult level, eye level. Sometimes it's said and believed children will save us from our adult ills. I think that is an ideal that is complicated. Some children learn some people learn disturbing traits from their parents, their grandparents, or whomever cares for them. Sometimes the nature, I'm sorry, I can't even read my own writing. Sometimes the nature of retribution in situations where children have survived horror surfaces as a very human trait. For that reason, as well as others, advocacy seated in love will always need to happen. That brings me back to the 1980s. And please put your comments and notes and whatever in the chat. And I'm going to yield to my colleague, Ellen. And thank you, Ellen.
Thank you. Thank you, Tomyé. So today, I won't be showing much of my artwork, but I'll be focusing on my personal art journey leading to the kind of work that I presented at the previous session. If you were here on Monday, perhaps you'll see some connecting threads. And since I didn't attend a mainstream art school, most of my art education came through specific art study and of course, life experience. I did study textile arts at UC Davis and the Pacific Basin School of Textile Arts back in the 60s and 80s. So here we go. So I was born in 1949 in San Jose, California, the third of three sisters, and raised in the community called Japantown, or as we call it, J-Town. And I show you this slide because I want you to see what Santa Clara Valley looked like then. It was very rural, not anything like the tech center it's become. No strip malls, no big housing developments. It was full of beautiful orchards and small family farms with a very small town feeling. But backing up a bit, I'd first like to tell you about our family's immigration to the United States. My grandparents immigrated to San Francisco in the 1890s from Japan, and both my parents were born in San Francisco in the early 1900s. They married there, then moved to San Jose in the 30s, where my dad started a small fertilizer manufacturing business. As I said, our family lived in Japantown, which was a tight-knit community, predominantly Japanese American, where everyone knew everyone. People supported each other, their businesses, and were pretty much insulated from the wider world. My mother's aunt and uncle had a small farm in Santa Clara. And this is my mom, her mother, sister, and cousin. Unfortunately, a few years after taking this very happy, carefree photo, their lives were turned upside down by World War II, when the whole family was forcibly imprisoned by the US government in American concentration camps, along with over 120,000 others of Japanese descent. Just to give you an idea of the camp where most of my family was sent, these are pictures of Heart Mountain in Wyoming and the barracks along the road. That's the type of housing they had. And you can see the Heart Mountain looming in the distance. These are photos of both sets of my grandparents, my mom and my sister in front of their barracks. And there you see Heart Mountain in the background again. They couldn't escape it, that view. As you can imagine, the incarceration experience had long-term negative effects on the family and even affected those of us who weren't even born yet. When they were finally released and went back to San Jose in 1945, they encountered a lot of racism and especially had a hard time finding even a place to live. But gradually they began rebuilding their lives, although they said little or nothing about the tough years they had just endured behind barbed wire. Growing up, I was pretty much unaware of the details, although I learned more when I went away to college, and that's when I started asking questions. Most of our family's friends were Japanese American or Asian American, and much of our social life revolved around the Buddhist Temple shown here which was right in the middle of Japantown. And this is a photo when they were renovating the original building. But in school, we mixed with classmates of many ethnic backgrounds, which I'm very grateful for. I'm also grateful for being exposed to Japanese culture at an early age. My paternal grandparents lived with us, and they were both very talented in the Japanese arts, so I was always making artsy things as a child. Here you can see I'm sitting in the front. I'm the chunky one in front working on an art project. And this is my second grade photo. Mrs. Morton, my teacher, standing in the back. In the front is my grandmother, Sumi. She was a flower arrangement teacher. And the other positive thing for me was that the Japantown community continued making many cultural customs. And so that gave me a sense of pride in my culture growing up. And you can see there, my sister and I are dressed in our kimono. We're going to dance in the customary celebration honoring our ancestors. And on the flip side, I realized that our parents wanted us to be regarded as Americans, quote unquote, which in those days meant assimilating into white society. I was aware of not fitting the white standard of beauty. We rarely saw Asian faces in the media unless they were negative stereotypes. So as a kid, I recall watching TV and wondering why our family looked so different from the so-called all-American families we saw on TV. And this is Tomyé and I had some discussions about the TV shows that we watched. And this was one of those family affairs that showed up on TV every week. But fortunately, by high school, our peer group expanded out to include even more Latinx, Black, and Asian classmates in a predominantly Latinx student body. I also was fortunate to have an art teacher who was very supportive and encouraged me to pursue my art if I so desired. So once I graduated from high school in 1967 and I left San Jose to go to college, my world opened up. There were many influences that began shaping my politics, but these were the four main ones: the Civil Rights Movement, the Black Power Movement, Third World Liberation Front strikes, and the anti-Vietnam War movement. During this time, my peers at UC Davis and I were becoming more politically conscious. We used our art skills to create posters and flyers like these. We marched in the streets against a war across the sea. And in 1968 came the Third World Liberation Strike for ethnic studies at San Francisco State and UC Berkeley. I became involved in the student movement at UC Davis to establish the first Asian American Studies class there. And this is a copy of the Asian American Movement newspaper that came out of LA, I believe in 1969. And it was very influential in keeping our connections since we didn't have the internet. And so I became involved in the student movement at UC Davis to establish the first Asian American Studies class there under the guidance of the late Professor Isao Fujimoto. You can see pictured on the right. I finally began learning more about the root causes of what really happened to Japanese Americans during World War II, since the true story of Asians in this country was never included in our history books. It motivated me to question more and ultimately to quit school in 1969. I got a job, saved some money, and I took my first trip to Japan. My 4-month stay there strengthened my sense of self and clarified my bicultural identity. I studied art and worked at the World Expo. You could see on the left, and that just was an opportunity to expand my horizons even more. Plus, living in a homogeneous culture like Japan empowered me in many ways. So I returned to the US in the summer of 1970, and I left straight for Eugene, Oregon, where I planned to complete my degree in education. Life in Eugene became an education outside the so-called ivory towers and more like an education out in the streets. I began connecting with various political groups and causes. For example, I continued in the anti-Vietnam War movement. I went to Canada for the Indo-Chinese Women's Conference in April of 1971. There we met with 6 representatives from North Vietnam who came to discuss the impact of the war on their country. I also worked with members of the Black Panther Party who were still living in Eugene, even as the FBI was breaking up most of the party chapters across the United States. The party continued to run a free breakfast program and a multicultural liberation school. We presented anti-racism symposiums that we called teach-ins. And as I met people in the Black community, which in Eugene was quite small, they taught me so much about the history of Jim Crow racism in Eugene and in Oregon in general, about the sundown laws in Oregon, the long history of the KKK and other extremist white supremacist groups in the area. Other projects I worked on were the Poor People's Council, which ran a food cooperative specifically to feed underserved children and families. The Migrant Farm Workers Support Network in Oregon was very strong, and we organized around the grape boycott at that time. And finally, I became a tutor with a prisoner support group called Inside Out that ran a program at the Salem Correctional Institute. So the next major impact on my political and artistic growth was traveling to Guatemala, where I stayed for 6 months. I traveled by car with my Guatemalan classmate and my 5 friends. This trip inspired me to study weaving on a floor loom when I returned to the States. I learned about the textile and weaving traditions there, visiting artisans all over the country. This is a view on the left of the volcano quite nearby called the Fuego volcano. And this is on the right, you could see someone filling her jar that was the watering hole. And then thanks to my Guatemalan friend who introduced me to an indigenous Mayan family in the highlands, I was able to spend 7 weeks with them. And I learned so much just by being a part of their daily lives, learning about their history, their years of oppression, war, and persecution. This was the family that I stayed with. And I even learned some traditional backstrap weaving from our neighbor. But needless to say, it was extremely difficult to leave this family when it came time to return to the States. It was actually quite heartbreaking. Then after I got home, and after 2 years, about 2 years later, I received more heartbreaking news that their whole village was destroyed and they perished in a horrible eruption of that Fuego volcano in 1974. Returning to California was a very big culture shock in many ways. But on the other hand, it was also a very exciting time. The Asian American cultural arts movement was gaining momentum in music, dance, visual arts, and performance. There was a non-Eurocentric arts presence growing from the Bay Area to Southern Cal and the East Coast. Bridge magazine was one of the early Asian American magazines that came out of New York, full of political commentary, art, poetry, news, and East Wind came out in the 1980s from California. Today, East Wind has returned online as East Wind e-zine, headed by one of the original editors, Eddie Wong. So reading these magazines at the time and learning about Asian American artists all across the US gave me a lot of inspiration and connection to the community. For many of us, it was starting to feel like we as Asian Americans were finally being seen. Pictured here is the cover of A Grain of Sand, and now it's recognized as the first album of Asian American music that came out in 1973 by Nobuko Miyamoto. And also Chris Ijima and Charlie Chin contributed to that album. Their original folk-inspired songs brought together Asian, Latinx, African, and Native Americans. And today, Nobuko on the left continues her activism through her multicultural organization called Great Leap. And this is a cover of her new memoir, her book that just was released. The Banhiroshima emerged in LA in 1974. They also are still performing today, and we're in the forefront of introducing a fusion of R&B, pop music, known for incorporating Western and Asian instruments. In the theater arts was the late Sachiko Nakamura, who was on the cutting edge of performance art based on her personal life story as an Asian American woman. This was all new to us. No other Asian Americans we knew of had presented this kind of material before. Here on the left, you can see Robert Kikuchi Ngoho, a multi-talented musician and performer, here playing the traditional Filipino kulintang gongs. And later, he and his wife, Nancy Wong, established the Asian American storytelling duo Ethnotech on the left here in San Francisco. And they're still performing and just celebrated their company's 40th anniversary. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. And I just wanted to show you some of the friends of mine who were starting 40 and 50 years ago. And it's so powerful to see them continuing today. But there was so much creativity, and we had a need to express in new ways. And for me, it was just beginning. In 1974, I had the opportunity to study Taiko with Grandmaster Seiichi Tanaka, founder of San Francisco Taiko Dojo, the first Taiko group established in North America. As you probably know, Taiko is the Japanese word for drum. And today, Taiko is found all over the world. So I joined some Asian American friends in San Jose, and we became the third group in North America, San Jose Taiko. And this was uncharted territory for us. For us as Japanese Americans, our experience here was quite different from that of people born in Japan. So our music was influenced by American and world music, jazz, rock, African rhythms, Latin percussion. So once again, we created our own Asian American style of expression. So after we discovered our voices through playing Taiko, two of my Taiko friends and I decided to establish a wearable art business collaboration called Earthenware. This was another form of Asian American self-expression, and this was the beginning of my journey towards becoming a visual artist. I drew from the lessons of my grandmother, who taught me how to sew, and I used many of those skills. We created our own line of contemporary ethnic-inspired clothing, integrating surface design treatments like quilting, embroidery, fabric, printing, applique. It was also a way for me to integrate my love of textiles of Asia and Latin America, India, and other countries. I met indigenous weavers and dyers in Peru, and I met Japanese Peruvians and learned more about the Japanese diaspora. Again, we were making a political statement, expressing art outside mainstream America, expressing our Asian American identity, and raising the visibility of our culture by creating art that empowered the wearer. In 1986, I moved to Oakland to set up my studio art practice at the Dutch Boy Paint Factory lofts, and another chapter opened. I transitioned away from wearable art, and I started a line of hand-painted silk wall pieces and home furnishings that were marketed by my collaborator, Linda Ito. These designs were inspired and influenced by Asian, Celtic, and pre-Columbian motifs. And of course, all my life experiences that grew out of my roots in San Jose, Japantown. So here's my last slide. We're back where I left off Monday at the 911 studios.